Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends who have traveled from other countries to join us for these discussions, good morning. Yesterday, at the inaugural session of this conference, we heard from some of the top minds within Pakistan and internationally thinking about the problem of climate change. It was an incredibly rich discourse, the discussion and presentation and discussion on incredibly critical data that needs to inform this subject. I'd like to say at the outset, on behalf of the Planning Ministry as well as the Public-Private Partnership Authority, that Dawn Media deserves the highest commendation for having created this effervescence in Islamabad on this critical subject. I say this also as we start the discussion on the subject of this panel, which is the role of the private sector, and thinking about sort of the issues associated with that. Those are, of course, something that, the pressing problems, it's the government's job to think about those things, and we've had tremendous support over the years, over the decades from development partners also. But there's something more powerful, I would say, when voices emerge from within society itself, and in particular from the private sector, which gives us hope that there's indeed a vibrancy, resolve, and seriousness also within the larger system to take on the toughest challenges. Climate change is in some ways a rather tough subject versus some other public policy issues. It's one that's high on the complexity scale. It has multiple causes, it manifests itself in very complex ways, and it has impacts that lie somewhere in the future, and causes that may be based in countries or beyond borders. But most importantly, it is an issue that implores us to leave the present and think about future generations. The complexity notwithstanding, the problem statement, I think, is now abundantly clear. It's clear as daylight and was put forward quite emphatically by the speakers yesterday. And in our context, Pakistan is among the top 5 countries that is most vulnerable. We face some of the highest disaster risks and need perhaps upwards of $300 billion USD till 2030 to combat climate change. Well, the problem is now quite clear, as I said. It's known and it's been clearly laid out. The question is what to do now. How do we tackle this? This discussion obviously is also timely because of what is happening at the global level, at the international level, and policy shifts elsewhere in the Western world are bound to have drastic impact if the policies continue in the way that they are being contemplated at this time, and not only internationally, but also for Pakistan itself. So it's in that sense, this conference is quite timely. As we open the discussion for this session, and as far as solutions go, the topic of this panel, which is the collaboration between public sector and private sector, I think takes center stage. It's not one of the issues that we need to think about. It's not a peripheral issue. To me, it stands at the very center of how the solution part of this thing comes in. So as we open the discussion for this panel, here's a fundamental thesis that I would posit. If we are to tackle the climate change problem, we need a fundamental shift. And we need the fundamental shift in a new kind of interaction between the government and the private sector. And if that approach is worked out, then the solutions will follow, but not without that fundamental shift in direction. Speaking from the perspective of the government, I'd like to posit that there is good news. The government, as I see it, has very much taken that facilitative turn, even if it's not fully there and a lot of work needs to be done to actually take it to the finish line. Through the Public-Private Partnership Authority, the P3A, there is now a fully functional, formal avenue to foster the public-private partnerships and dialogue, which sort of is important as it sort of exemplifies this fundamental shift in approach. So how is the PPP mindset different? And how is it sort of, what's the political philosophy or theory the policy principles that we in the government have sort of thought about in terms of kind of creating this new entity and the new framework largely in the last 5 years. So it fundamentally involves reimagining the role of the government from sort of the traditional bureaucratic state, which is kind of arm's length from the private sector, or one might even say it's kind of cautiously watching over economic activity, more sort of a regulatory state perspective, and sort of a hierarchical relationship to sort of curate economic activity. So that model needs reimagination, and that's what this framework precisely desires to do, where the government is now willing to sit across the table from the private sector, become a partner in order to solve problems which cannot be solved otherwise. There's no way to do that. So this sort of arrangement is also complex. That hierarchical thing, developed over centuries is kind of a model that has been quite worked out, the bureaucratic state and the issues therein. This requires proper framework, incentives, well-designed programs and projects. It also requires a sort of a sophisticated understanding and allocation of function. The government is good at certain things. The government also has responsibilities that should be well known in terms of delivery of public goods, universal education, the climate change issue also. But the understanding that the government is then not good at certain things. So for example, not in every area, but in many areas, government perhaps should not be in service delivery, in project execution, which can better be carried out by the private sector, and hence calibrating that and designing that so that neither the public sector sort of goals nor the sort of imperative of the private sector gets short-sold. How do you kind of design that? It requires a degree of sort of political, economic, financial, legal sophistication. Question, are we ready to take advantage of this? What are the changes that we will need to bring about in our frameworks and systems? Both sides must evolve. The government, as I see it, despite the frameworks, needs to start to have that attitude to act as a partner. As stated yesterday, climate change is no longer a distant threat, it's now a lived reality. And therefore, under the UDAN program, which is this country's government's flagship sort of government sort of transformational program, environment and climate change is one of the 5 fundamental pillars, showing the government's seriousness towards sort of framing this adequately as being, a top-level priority. We have some of the top minds from Pakistan's corporate sector with us on this panel and the next panel that will come after this. As the government, our approach will be to engage intently and listen and find ways to work together. And indeed, the dialogue must continue beyond today. On behalf of the P3A and the Planning Ministry, we note that we envision P3A to be a conduit of, between the government and the private sector, and would welcome and engage your reaching out and working closely to design joint programs, projects to help solve our most pressing problems. Thank you very much.